Nazareth was a master teacher, and some of his most well-known teachings are told in short stories called parables.
Yeah, like the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who was looking for pearls. And when he found the ultimate pearl, he sold everything so that he could buy it.
Must have been some pretty amazing pearl.
Or the kingdom of God is like a tiny mustard seed that a farmer planted in his garden. It grew and became a huge tree, and birds came to perch in its branches.
And that's a beautiful image, but what does it mean?
Exactly. Jesus didn't tell parables to make everything clear. Rather, he wanted to provoke the imagination and invite people to see what God is doing in the world from a new perspective.
So let's talk about how to read the parables of Jesus. Now, there's many great teachers that throughout history have used stories to teach students about morality, religion, philosophy.
But Jesus didn't use his parables to teach abstract religious or moral ideals. He said that his parables were about himself and his mission.
His mission, which was to announce that the kingdom of God was arriving on earth as it is in heaven.
Right. So in Jesus' day, the Israelites were ruled by the Roman Empire. But their scriptures promised that one day their God would come to rule his people as king. And so many Israelites wanted to revolt against Rome and fight for their freedom.
And this is what some people thought of as the kingdom of God.
Exactly. But Jesus was a poor, traveling prophet, healing the sick, inviting people to follow him. And he said that this was the arrival of God's kingdom.
And that didn't fit people's expectations.
Right. And so Jesus used some parables to help people imagine that his small movement was the arrival of God's kingdom.
Oh yeah, like the parable that the kingdom of God is yeast hidden in a lump of dough. And you might not see its influence, but it's gonna change everything.
Jesus also told parables about the upside-down values of God's kingdom, about how the least important people in the world are actually the most important people to God, especially those who are poor and of low status.
Yeah, like the parable about the business owner who hired workers throughout the day, in the morning, later in the day, and even towards the end of the day. And when it was time to pay everyone, he paid them all the same wage.
Right, Jesus is showing how money and status are irrelevant to God, who offers his generous mercy to everybody.
Now, not all of the parables have happy endings. Some are really intense.
Yes, Jesus stood in the tradition of Israel's prophets, who also told parables to criticize Israel's leaders because they mistook their kingdom for God's. So Jesus warned the leaders of his day. If they don't accept his offer of God's kingdom, they're headed for destruction.
Yeah, like the parable of the landowner who built a wonderful vineyard, and he expects it to produce fruit.
Yes, Jesus gets this parable from the prophet Isaiah, but then he adapts it.
Right, and so the landowner appoints managers to take care of this vineyard. And at harvest, he sends servants to collect the fruit. But those managers kill the servants.
And so the landowner sends his own son to confront the managers, and they kill him too. And so Jesus asked the people around him, what do you all think this landowner should do?
Oh, he's gonna punish those managers and hire new ones.
Jesus knew that if Israel kept on their current path, they would be destroyed by Rome. And so in parables like this, he's forcing people to make a decision about his offer of God's kingdom. Are people going to reject him, ignore him, or trust and follow him?
Now, if this message of God's kingdom is so important, why cloak it in parables? Why not be more clear?
Well, through riddles and parables, Jesus could make really bold claims that revealed truth to people who were open-minded.
For those who have ears to hear, they could ponder it and go deeper.
But the parables would also conceal his message from those who were against him, so that he could buy more time.
Buy time for what?
Well, Jesus was preparing his closest followers for the greatest surprise yet. Jesus claimed that Israel's God was coming to rule over his people not through coercion or violent force, but through self-giving love, as he was going to die for their sins.
But his death wasn't the end.
Right. He said that his death would be like a tiny seed buried in the ground, but then it would grow and produce a crop with many seeds.
So these parables, they explain who Jesus was and what he was up to.
And the gospel authors have preserved these parables so that now every generation of Jesus' followers can read and ponder them.
And imagine how God's kingdom is still at work even today.
Right. These ancient parables are still full of new surprises and challenges. They're like a storehouse packed with treasures, some that are new, some that are old, and it's all just waiting to be discovered.
No? Now can you hear me? Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning to all of you. This is awesome that you're all here bright and early. This is my first time here at Men of Hope Wednesdays. It's not that I'm not normally up at this time. It's just that I have two little ones, and we're chasing them around the house at this hour. But I think I'm going to have to come check this out in future weeks because it seems like a good group, and it's awesome that you guys get up and get going and connecting with each other at this time. So, like Chris said, my name's Eric Peyton. I'm the Connections Coordinator here at Hope, and basically that means I get to work with all of our network of small groups primarily, but also do some adult classes as well. We've got somewhere around 500 small groups just at the West Des Moines campus that meet off-site in homes throughout the week. So that's my main focus. There's also, if you've heard of the Apprentice Series or Financial Peace University or New Member Class, those sort of things, I get to work with those groups as well. I've been here for about 10 years now. I started in Revive, which, is anyone familiar with Revive? The young adult ministry meets in the chapel right behind me. Started as a seminary intern about 10 years ago, and then shortly moved into this position. And this clicker, there we go. I actually met my wife in the chapel at Revive as well, about a little like half sandwich that way. This is not my family. I skipped it. This is kind of, there we go. Okay, this is my family right here. Just a little bit about me. That's my wife, Carla. Like I said, we met in the chapel there. And our boys, McAllister, who she's holding, he's 5, and Rory, or McAllister goes by Cal, a little bit shorter. And then Rory, who I'm holding. Both of them are golf names. If you know anything, if you've met me before, you know I'm a huge golf nut. So Rory, you can probably guess how that's a golf name. If you can guess how McAllister is a golf name, come talk to me afterwards, and I'll give you a big high five. But and then that's our little dog there. We all take Jesus very seriously. She takes Jesus the most literally, though. She's got one eye, so she gouged it out because it apparently caused her to sin. I don't know if you can see that there, but my kids call her the Winky Lumpy Doggy. If you're familiar with children's books, there's the Winky Wonky Donkey. Yeah, Chris knows it, and she's an old dog, but we love her. But anyway, so that's a little bit about me. Here at Men of Hope on Wednesday mornings, you've been reading through the Bible like the rest of the church and are looking at the parables of Jesus right now. And this, because it's one thing to read the Bible. I remember in college I read through the Bible a couple times in a year and had no idea what I was reading and was so confused, so lost. And it's a whole other thing to actually understand what the Bible says. And so it's really awesome to be doing that as a church together. Because like I said, I've done it a couple times. I've read through it on my own in a year. I've read it through with my wife in a year. And it's even better to do it as a whole church together so that you've got a bunch of people around you who are doing the same things. But this series of videos that the Bible Project has made, it's about 19 or 20 videos long. It's just got some really great information on how you can better read the Bible. So I'd encourage you to go check that out because I know you're not going through all of them here at Men of Hope. But I spent a lot of money and a lot of years on a seminary education, and they've made it in a lot of ways better and simpler than my seminary education ever did on how to read the Bible. So it's a really great resource. But today we're talking about the parables of Jesus, and they're these short stories. If you're familiar with the Bible, you're probably familiar with these short stories that Jesus taught. These made-up stories that he taught to communicate a point. And it's very different than how we would communicate in our world. Most of us don't respond to questions with a story. If you get an email at work that says, "Hey, what do you think of this project?" you probably don't say, "Let me tell you a story." And if you do, you probably should stop that because I bet people don't really like that. They probably just want an answer because in our culture we value clarity and directness and conciseness. We want people to know what exactly we're thinking. They want to know what the right answer is. And so it's obvious the way that Jesus teaches that he values something very different than we do in the world as far as communicating. And because he taught in these parables, he was often misunderstood. We know that often the Pharisees would misunderstand, but sometimes the disciples would misunderstand as well. And in these parables, they kind of force you to look at different ideas in different ways. And like I said, we value being right in the world. If you think about political candidates specifically, if a candidate has a different view, 20 years ago, that's often viewed, if they're running today, as a bad thing because they flip-flop, right? They flip-flop on ideas. But they've come to a place where they've changed their mind, and that's viewed as a little bit of a negative. And it's almost the worst of all sins in our world is to be wrong, but not according to Jesus, I think. As we look at these parables, that doesn't seem to be his primary value. And these parables, they're dynamic ways of teaching things that have different perspectives, different angles, and so they can teach multiple things at once, and they also invite discussion. And so if you were to imagine going and seeing Jesus teach, and he tells this parable, you're probably walking away with the people you came with or whatever, and you're saying, what do you think he meant by that? And it allows you to try on different ideas, to say, I think he meant this, I think he meant this, I think it was this that he was highlighting. And so discussion and the possibility of being wrong is something that I think Jesus is kind of okay with. He's almost trusting the process of discussing it and finding out what the true answer is to what he's trying to communicate. And so he doesn't really seem primarily concerned with us getting the correct idea right away, which again is very different than what we'd anticipate in our world today. There's no real urgency or need to get there right away. So which begs the question, why would he ever teach this way? If his message is so important, why not make it incredibly clear and easy for everyone to understand, right? Well, luckily, that is working. Okay. Luckily, he did answer this very question. In Matthew 13, his disciples come to him, and I'm just going to read this passage here. It says, his disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you use parables when you talk to people?" And he replied, "You are permitted to understand the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but others are not." Now, I'm just going to wait right there. That seems very, to me, exclusive of Jesus. Like he's saying, well, some are in, some are out, and we're just going to keep those separate. And everything that I know from reading Jesus in the Bible, he's a very inclusive person. He wants everyone to come to him. But right away in that first sentence in his response, it sounds like he's separating. He's saying, I don't want these people to understand, but I want you to understand. But then he kind of goes on and explains a little bit more. He says, "To those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given, and they will have an abundance of knowledge. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. That's why I use parables." So he's allowing people to self-select in or out. It's not that he's drawing a line and saying, I'm not allowing you, I'm allowing you. But he's allowing people themselves to have their heart in a way to receive his message. And listening appears to be the key point of the parables, is those who truly listen. If you know anything about me, I think Chris might have sent an email a little bit before that I'm a golf pro. I'm a part-time golf pro. I've been a golf pro since over 15 years, teaching and playing the game. And listening to me is a little bit like putting, okay? So stay with me here. Who's played golf before? Who's a golfer? Okay. Now, who would say that they're a good putter? Whoa. Okay. I saw 2 hands, I think. Okay. That's pretty normal, right? So listening is kind of like both the easiest skill in the world, but also the hardest skill in the world. And that's kind of the way with putting. During the pandemic, I made a putting green in my basement because everyone had their little projects, right, when we were locked inside. So I made a putting green, and now my little 2-year-old he takes his little Fisher-Price club and he putts around. He knows how to putt. He's known how to putt for probably a year and a half now. And but what he's doing is very different than what Tiger Woods is doing, right? It's the same thing, but it's different. Everyone knows how to mini golf, but does everyone really know how to putt? And so listening is, in my mind, I tend to see the world through the golf lens, is a little bit like, that's like listening and hearing. Everyone can hear and listen somewhat, but not everyone is really good at listening. And actually, this happened just a couple weeks ago. My wife had a funeral in California, and so she flew out a Saturday morning. I had the kids all weekend. She got home like a Sunday night. And because she's amazing, she made some meals ahead of time for me to just easily heat up for the kids for lunch and dinner. And she was explaining these to me, like, here's where the ingredients are. Here's where everything is. And she got on the plane and she left, and it was lunchtime, so we didn't even get one meal in. And I had no idea where these ingredients were, because they weren't where they normally were. She had made them too easy for me, and she set them out on the counter, where I was looking through the pantry and trying to find where these things are, because that's where they normally are. And I wasn't listening to her when she was explaining where those things were at, and so I embarrassingly had to text her and say, now where's this part of the ingredient? And we don't have a huge counter. We don't have this huge house. The where it was sitting was right in front of me. I just hadn't seen it because I assumed that I knew exactly where it is. And so they say familiarity breeds contempt. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but familiarity definitely breeds not listening as well, right? Because I was listening to her. I was aware of what she was saying. I could hear her, but I was assuming I already knew the answer, so I didn't really need to listen all that closely. And so that's kind of the way with parables is that when we come to them, when we assume we already know the answer, sometimes it's hard to catch what is being said, or maybe learn something new from it. Jesus said this himself in Luke 4, where he was rejected in his own hometown. He says, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. He was rejected at Nazareth because people looked at him and they said, well, that's just the carpenter's son. They completely missed who he was because they had this assumption about who he was right away. And so that comes to what my current favorite parable is. And Chris had asked me to kind of share a little bit about what my favorite parable is. I'm not sure I always have a favorite parable, or even a favorite Bible verse. It tends to be just the one that's most recently taught me something new. And so that one for me is the Good Samaritan. And that's one of those that everyone is familiar with, right? There's like the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan. Those are the ones that, even if you're not in the church, you kind of know what the story's about. And so it's easy to come to this story with assumptions that I already know what this one is about. But this one is one that's recently taught me something. I'm just going to read it real quick. And what I want you to do is just kind of listen to it. Maybe just close your eyes. Sometimes reading along with it doesn't help listening, but just listen to the words and see if anything stands out to you that's new this time. So it goes, Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed by him. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits, Jesus asked. The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. So this one there's a lot of interesting things about this one. And one of the things that I like to do with parables is go to the thing that's immediately before it. And in this case, it's the most important or the greatest commandment, where Jesus asked what the greatest commandment is. And he says, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the response from the audience is, well, who's my neighbor? Which is, the question is, well, who exactly do I have to love? And so this story is a direct response to that. And what I love about this story is that Jesus doesn't answer the question. He sort of does. He uses the same words, he uses neighbor, but what the question Jesus answers is, what does it look like to be a neighbor? And he assumes the answer is already, well, it's loving everyone. The guy asked, who do I have to love? And he says, this is what it looks like to love everyone, right? And so it's very subtle, but if I don't look at the thing right before it, then you don't even realize that he's turning the question kind of on its head, and he's answering the question that he thinks needs to be answered rather than the question that's answered. And so he assumes right away that everyone is your neighbor. And so then at the very end of the passage in verse 35, I'll pull it up here because it's too small on my notes. This is the one part that stood out to me as well. He says, the next day he handed him, the innkeeper, 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. So it's the Samaritan, he's leaving. He's leaving the man after he's taken care of him, and he's telling the innkeeper to continue to take care of this man, and this man has no ability to even thank the guy for his help, right? He's still kind of tending to his wounds. And what I've recently done with this story is put myself in the position, I guess, of the Samaritan and said, well, what would I have done after I went through all of this trouble to take care of this man? What would I have done in the end there? Because he could have waited till he was all better, seen if he was going to pay him back, thanked him profusely, praised him, let everyone know this amazing thing that this guy did, or even made sure that the guy didn't travel that road again or did it safely the next time and didn't end up in that position again. And what's interesting is that right before, where he's talking about the most important commandment, Jesus says, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then the man says, the man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, and who's my neighbor? And I think that's kind of interesting, the ways that I personally justify my actions of who is able to receive my love and who isn't. And the ways we do that in sort of sneaky ways of either wanting recognition, like, oh, I could do this thing, I could serve, I could help love this person in a way, but how am I gonna be praised or thanked afterwards, or how am I gonna be paid back, financially or with karma or whatever the worldly term would be, or even for the person to change their ways on what they were doing in the first place. I think about this a lot with when I see people who are begging on the street for money. A lot of times I have this struggle, and I think a lot of people do, to say, well, I could help them out, but I think they're just going to use this money in a way that is not helpful for them, which that's a very difficult conversation to have. But a lot of times we say, well, there's this expectation to my love, to me serving this person, for them to respond in such a way that benefits me, or there's some expectation on them to do the right thing. And so there's a little delay in this. Okay, so what I'm learning with this, the first thing is with parables is to recognize my familiarity with them. And a lot of times when I'm reading the Bible, it's very easy to read through it quick. As we're reading through the Bible together, I'm doing a lot of listening to the audio, and it's very tempting to hit the speed up button and go 1.5 times speed or 2 times speed to just get through the reading and just get through it. Because I know this passage, I've read it 1,000 times. I'm just going to read through it quick just so I can say that I did it. But I have to catch myself a lot to recognize when I'm familiar with a passage, especially a parable, that maybe there's something else there that I'm not seeing, or that I'm assuming, and I'm not truly listening to what Jesus is saying. So putting aside those assumptions and ignoring distractions that might come my way from truly listening to what Jesus has to say. And then the second thing is how to love, not who to love. That comes in the, saying, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering the question, here's how a neighbor is to love others, to love everyone. And so oftentimes I try to catch myself basically asking the wrong question of who is it that needs to be loved versus how to love, and how Jesus kind of flips that on its head. And the final one is having zero expectations of any sort of response. And sometimes they're very sneaky expectations of when I try to do something loving or serving someone, of something that I don't even think about, is a sneaky expectation that I have that's attached to my love of that person. A person responding correctly or praising you in some way is kind of what I've noticed are sneaky ways that we attach to our serving or our love. So kind of to go back to the beginning of when I was saying I've been here for about 10 years. I want to tell you one more story before we wrap things up. One of the reasons that I'm here at Hope is because of my dad, both actively and inactively, I guess. It was about 11 years ago. I was a golf pro at a golf club in Kansas, middle of nowhere, Kansas. I had gotten off work, and I was playing a round of golf, and I remember I was on the 17th tee box, and I got a text from my dad, and it was a little out of the ordinary. He just said, "Hey, when you get a chance, please call me as soon as possible," which I remember that vividly because it was kind of strange. And so I called him when I got off the golf course, and I remember that he told me just out of the blue, we weren't expecting it or anything, that he had been diagnosed with cancer, and it was a bad form of cancer. He lasted about 109 days after that phone call, but I ended up moving home after that, and so that's how I kind of got back to Des Moines. But then he also knew someone here at Hope, and at the time I was starting to take some seminary classes and needed somewhere to serve. And so he had connected me with Revive, and that's kind of where I got started. But there's a story that my dad used to tell me growing up, and it was something that was kind of formational and foundational in his life. And when he grew up in Troy Mills, Iowa. Does anyone know where that is? No. One? All right. It's in Lynn County. It's eastern Iowa. And every Sunday morning when he would jump in his car with his family to go to church, they would drive by this corner that they used to call Kirk's Corner. And on the corner was this graveyard, the cemetery, that the guy who took care of it, his name was George Kirk. This was in the 60s. And he took care of the graveyard, he mowed it, he dug the graves. And one thing my grandpa would always say to my dad was, well, Mr. Kirk, he's dug his own grave, which seems a little strange. He's a little weird. But when you get behind the story, he had dug his own grave, and he'd filled it with sand, because in that area of the country, there's this thick clay and in that time, it was very difficult to dig graves. It was a difficult process, and George Kirk was the only one in that area, in that small town, who had that skill. And so he had dug his grave and filled it up with sand so that when he died later, it would be easier for the next people to dig that grave. And so he was giving in such a way that no one could ever pay him back. And so that was a story that really shaped my dad in his life. He would always talk about filling your grave full of sand, so that you could serve someone and they not even know about it, and they not even be able to thank you later on. But you can love someone in a very unique way that has zero expectations attached to it. And so when my dad died, I remember at his funeral, a bunch of people came up to me and were saying, "Here's the ways that your dad has done something to bless me that no one ever knew about, and I feel like someone needs to know." And so that was just really impactful for me, and I see that in this story of the Samaritan who had no expectation of receiving anything in response from the man who he helped. And so I'm going to finish with Matthew 6:3 says, "When you give to the needy," Jesus says, "don't let your left hand know what your right is doing." And so as you go into your groups for discussion questions, I've got these questions here. just to talk about with your group. The first one is, what's getting in the way of you really listening to both Jesus and to others? When was the last time you changed your mind on something? I think this is a question that's always fun to ask people because it's very unusual in our world in this day and age for people to admit that they've changed their mind or they changed their mind on something. What are some of the sneaky ways that we expect a return on our good deeds? And then how can you love someone this week in a way that you can't be identified or even paid back for what you've done? So that's all I've got. Thank you for letting me join you this morning, and I guess I'll just send you into your groups and have a good time in those discussions. All right, thanks.